Good day, fellow champions of inclusion. I am A. Ron, and this is the Inclusive Dad Podcast, where we explore inclusion and make it practical. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe, rate, or review the show on your favorite platform. We truly appreciate your feedback and would be honored if you shared the podcast with friends and family who might benefit. If you want to support us in our mission, please click on the link in the show description. Today, my guest is Leroy Slanzi. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate being here.
Absolutely. Why don't you just start us off by just telling me a little bit about yourself?
Okay. Well, I always like to start off telling people that I have two kids. I have a son who's 18, is in college. I have a daughter who's 16. She's still in high school. Interesting fact, my daughter's actually just been recently diagnosed with a learning disability. So that's been a bit of a tumultuous 6 months in her world for her. Something that I've kind of known her whole life, but she hasn't been ready until now and to get diagnosed and whatnot. So, and besides that, I'm a principal. I've been a principal of a high school, middle, elementary school, currently a principal of an elementary school. My background's in special ed, and I have a real strong connection to student behavior as well. So it's my bag right there: special ed, mental health, emotional intelligence, and student behavior.
Sure. Thank you so much. Let's start off. What is your definition of inclusion?
My definition of inclusion revolves around everyone outside of a student who may be neurodivergent. I think a lot of times we get lost in schools and in communities around making sure that a child who is vulnerable gets to be included in everything, that they can go to birthday parties, they can sit in assemblies, they should be in every class, they should, which is important. They should be included and be able to go wherever they want to go. However, for me, the biggest thing is everyone around those students that have disabilities. Those students are the ones who are going to be the most compassionate and empathetic and caring for those kids from, birth into school, outside of school. And we want our kids to be able to get on a bus with someone who may have autism, and if they see something going sideways, be able to step in and help, and be able to recognize what's going on for other people. And I think the biggest thing for me around inclusion is that we have kids that can accept anyone and everyone, and not just see kids who have a visible disability, but also those kids who have an invisible disability, and be kind and compassionate. And so that's, for me, that's inclusion, is when our kids and our population as a whole, can see past behavior and think, okay, what is this person struggling with? And when we can get to a place where our society and our kids and our schools, recognize that somebody may be struggling for a different reason other than, them being crazy, we'll be in a better place.
Yeah, I love that. What got you started in special education?
I finished teacher school, and I got my first job at a middle school, and they put me into a program called Foundation Skills. My dream job was to teach, grade 5, 6. I'm a social studies guy and stuff, and instead, my first gig was in a Foundation Skills. And way back in the day, 25 years ago, they streamed kids with vulnerabilities into one class. So kids with learning disabilities, kids with behavior issues, kids who struggled academically. Unfortunately, here in Canada, Indigenous kids, which is part of that systematic racism that goes on here. And, I was in that Foundation Skills program for about 3 years, and I really connected with those kids. There's just something about working with such a dynamic group of kids and their disabilities and whatnot. And next thing I know, I'm like, I need to do a master's in this. And from there, I left that job and finished my master's in special ed and became a special ed teacher in a high school. And the rest is history. It was something that I felt comfortable with. And even as a school-based administrator, I'm always more comfortable in a resource room or working with special ed teachers and EAs. And it's just the place that I want to be, because it kind of dictates how you manage and develop your special ed program. The rest of the school will follow, everything. athletics, fine arts, everything follows how well your special ed program works, right? So yeah.
Can you go into that? When I listened to your video, I think you kind of talked a little bit about that. Can you go into a little bit more what you mean when you say like how your special ed program runs and works kind of dictates how the rest of the school goes?
Sure. It's funny. I just finished my third book on leadership,
Okay.
and I talk about pillars of leadership, and one of the pillars revolves around structural leadership. And every school that I go into, I try to structure schools physically first and foremost, and then I structure schools based on need. And so whenever I go into a school, I move the student services department, which will include the special ed department, the counseling department, the
Mm-hmm.
learning assistance department, the, for us, Indigenous education department, literally to the heart of the school, to the center of the school. And I do that because I don't want my special ed kids off in some corner or out in some portable. I don't want my Indigenous kids pushed away over here, or the learning
Right.
assistant program pushed over there, or the counselors in a place you can't find them in. And so when you centralize student services, which encompasses all those things, it's easy to find anyone that you need to help you as a student, because they're in the heart of the building. And for teachers, because teachers desperately need education assistants, special ed teachers, counselors, everybody for kids outside of kids with disabilities as well. And so they know where to go.
Right.
And it also taps into that inclusion piece, because when your heart and soul is your student services department, there's no one gets to escape through it. Everybody has to flow through the heart of the school at any point in the day, and they're having conversations with kids with disabilities. They're having conversations with the experts in this field, and as a result, that stems out in this compassion and empathy. It just flows out into the rest of the school. Not to mention, it allows teachers easier access to understanding, adapting their instruction, and differentiating their curriculum, and if they need help developing individualized education programs, etc., it's all right there. And so it's one of those things that you build the school around, because it's your highest need, right? And if you
Right.
don't, and your highest need doesn't get the support it needs, and it starts to falter, it's like a domino. The moment you can't support students with special needs, teachers struggle, students struggle, and it just and you end
Right.
up in a toxic environment, right? So that's what I mean by that. That's part of the reason why I wrote the book on leadership and involved those 5 pillars, specifically the structural one, because your heart and soul has to be your most vulnerable students.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense to me. So how I got involved in the inclusion part of it is, like we said off camera, I have a daughter, 22. Her name's Cecilia. She has in the U.S. Classified as severely multiply impaired, so checks multiple boxes, to qualify for special education. So, in my background is I don't ever recall hearing the word disability, being around anybody with a disability growing up. So, as a parent, she's diagnosed with cerebral palsy, epilepsy. School people come in. I'm listening to them because I have no other frame of reference, which meant she got shipped across town to the segregated resource room. Like you're saying, it was off down a hallway through at least one set of double doors that were closed all the time, maybe two. So
Wow.
off in the corner. Then found out about inclusion, and then since she was already kind of down that path of being, down that hall, trying to get her back in the general education classes, it was a struggle, honestly, through high school, because now she had to like jump through hoops that weren't really there if you're already in gen ed. So that's kind of how my inclusion piece, my world of inclusion started, and so that makes a lot of sense to me. Like if that classroom is in the middle of the school, that would make a huge difference. Because like I said, she was down a hallway, at least one set of closed doors, maybe two. So like yeah, if you're over there, you're never seen. The other kids don't see you, so that makes a lot of sense to me.
Out of sight, out of mind, which means there's no
Yep.
compassion and empathy
Right.
built with the rest of your student. That's sad. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. That's how her
Yeah.
experience was in school. That's sad. Actually,
Yeah.
very sad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what? I mean, what do you, what percentage of schools maybe are set up like the way you're suggesting? Like, I mean, do you have any idea like how many schools kind of do that focus where they put the student service stuff in the middle of the building?
Not a lot.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's not a lot. And for
Right.
me, it started, 25 years ago when I was in that foundation skills program. I was out in a portable. And when my kids came into the building, the looks that we got from teachers and
Right.
other students, because
Right.
we were the weird kids,
Yeah.
and it hurt my heart. It really hurt my heart. And these kids aren't weird. They have so much to offer. And so, it was when I got to the high school and actually became a special ed teacher. My classroom just happened to be more centralized.
Okay.
It was the year before, it was in the basement, but because we had a student in a wheelchair, there was no accessibility, so they had to move
Okay.
us up to the second floor.
Sure.
So it was by fluke. But what I noticed right away is that all of a sudden, this, because teachers, like, I'm a pretty friendly guy, and
Right.
I coached basketball, so I was involved in the athletics community, and teachers would naturally, I was easier to find, which
Right.
means my kids were easier to find. And so those conversations I was having with teachers, all of a sudden they're like, these teachers who teach calculus and chemistry are
Right.
now talking to my kids because they're
Right.
talking to me. So,
Yep.
but I don't want to point fingers or anything like that, but I left the school and recently, and I noticed that it's sort of slowly starting to be dismantled. I had a support room for kids who struggled with, drugs and alcohol and other disabilities, and
Sure.
then I had a special ed classroom that was down a main hallway, and from what I understand, it was moved because of laundry services, but you can use laundry after school. And this class with the behavior kids was moved down to a far corner of the building, closer to the vape pit, which I guess is good for those kids, but it still removes them from the center of the
Right.
building. And so, and I understand the logistics in terms of why schools would do that, because it's easier. It's
Right.
easier to hide those kids than it is to educate adults. And so I'm hoping with this book that I wrote, and the more because I do a lot of workshops in schools. For
Sure.
example, I just did a workshop on Friday. I was on Vancouver Island, and before I start the workshop, I get there early, make sure my technology's working.
Yep.
But I go walk around the school just to get a feel for where things are, like where's the library, where's the
Sure.
student service center, where's the First Nations support workers room. And I got to tell you, I've done a ton of workshops, and I don't often find those rooms centralized. I find them put in places where there's spare classrooms and whatnot. And
Mm-hmm.
libraries are typically centralized. Libraries are, because everybody
Right.
needs to access it.
Yep.
And unfortunately, student services, special ed rooms are not on the same level as need as the library, but they are, because if a teacher has a kid with special needs in their classroom and that kid struggles, it throws the whole class off. And if they have to, so it is just as important as the library, right? And so,
Right.
I would say more often than not, it's not centralized. It's kind of something that I do. I know there's principals out there who do it. I know the more I interact with principals, the more they, read my book,
Sure.
they do it. And I just wished it happened. But like
Yeah.
the problem is too, is there's so many administrators, vice principals, principals, assistants, principals, who have no special ed background. So
Okay.
they don't they don't see the need as much as they just see it as it's a funding thing. Oh, it's an IEP thing. Oh, it's just this compartment that's over there.
Sure.
However, it's usually huge. It's usually massive, right? And I hope, by podcasts like yours that, let people listen to this. And if other administrators and principals listen to this, they'll start to think about centralizing student services, because it's just better for kids, all kids.
Right. Can you speak to, I mean, I kind of have this assumption that, well, I mean, I can tell from, I mean, my journey with inclusion is like, I'm for full inclusion. So I wanted my daughter fully included in the gen ed classes. And when I would bring up the word inclusion, like the special ed director, was in a lot of our meetings because she was with my daughter early on, and then just would come to a lot of the meetings. But when I talked about inclusion, she would, nod her head, yes, inclusion, and then from how they would what they would do, their actions later on, I knew we had a different definition. How much impact does like the administration of the school or the school district have like on inclusion and the stance that the district has for inclusion?
Yeah, I think it has a lot. I'll give you an example. So in the last school district I worked in, there was this debate between a push-in model and a
Yep.
pull-out model in terms of
Yep.
student support, and they would go all in. Like, we're not a pull-out school, we're a push-in. That means EAs are pushed in. That means the special ed teachers pushed in, the students pushed in. And I would just, it's like I would just scratch my head, and it was like, so we're going to go down a path where we're going to dictate what's best for a kid based on a model, when
Right.
for kids, you have to treat every kid, like that old accordion, that's got the
Yep.
piano on it and stuff. And for one kid, the push in, pull out model, they both might work. Or
Yep.
because and so, for example, every Monday morning at my school, because I'm at an indigenous school now, every Monday morning we get in our gym and we drum and we sing.
Okay.
We do some social emotional learning stuff, but the drums get loud, right? And so we have kids
Right.
that come in and they have earmuffs on and stuff like that, and we encourage them to come in, and sometimes those earmuffs come in and they get thrown on the ground and the kid storms out, and we don't force the kid back. It's like, all
Right.
right, this is not for you right now, but other days the earmuffs come on and they're listening to the drum and they're
Yeah.
coping. And so, unfortunately, school districts get into this world of, we're going to use this model and do it this way, and
Right.
it should never be done like that. It should be based on student need and capability. So, for example, if your daughter's capable of being in chemistry 11, she should be in chemistry 11 with the
Right.
adaptations she needs.
Yep.
If she's not and she needs to be in environmental science instead,
Yep.
put her in environmental science. If you have kids who can't do English 12 because they're reading at a grade 2 level, well, then let's get them into learning assistance and change their programming so it fits where they're at. So
Right.
it should be based on need rather than opinion of model. And unfortunately, I deal with I've had a lot of conversations with people in admin and district principals of special ed, and they dive right into inclusion. They need to be in everything. We need to force it. It's like, well, maybe that kid doesn't want to be there.
Yeah.
Maybe they want to be, right. And so I really caution people when they jump on the word inclusion and they think it means all in, when it should mean you include that child where they want to be and where they're capable of being, right? And so for you, if you wanted your daughter in the general ed population and she was capable, she should have been there.
Right.
It should have been no question.
Yep.
And they should have had the resources to support that. If she
Right.
wasn't, well, then they should have resources to support her where she was at,
For sure.
right? So
Yep.
Unfortunately, it all depends on the district you're in and whatever freaking model they're following at the time. Yeah.
Do you have any strategies for parents? So for like me, like in my situation where our definition of inclusion and the school districts was different, and I mean, we're in a small town around 20,000, and there isn't really a lot of stuff nearby, so it never was really an option for us to like. We weren't a metropolitan; we could just move somewhere else easily. So, do you have any like tips for parents if you're in like a situation like that? What's the best way to approach the teacher or administration to work with them to try to push inclusion down the path there?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start in the trenches, right? The hardest thing is the classroom teacher who has a student with special needs in their class with no support. The first thing they want is that
Yep.
kid out of class, because it's hard, it's distracting for other kids, blah blah blah, right? And then it goes up to the admin, and they'll either try to push the kid back into class with no supports, and then there becomes this fight and whatnot, or sometimes they pull them out and they do what they did with your daughter and stream her into a different situation. I'm also in a small town of 10,000 people. The nearest city is about 45 minutes away. So our
Okay.
parents don't have access to, provincial outreach for autism.
Yep.
They don't have access to occupational therapists, speech language pathologists, all that sort of stuff. But what I would encourage parents to do is our schools have to follow the human rights code of ethics, right? And there's anti-discrimination laws out there, and it doesn't hurt to say, hey, this feels like a human rights violation in terms of where my kid is getting support. They have a right to these supports. I'm not sure what it's like in the United States, but we follow the UN conventions and whatnot.
Okay.
And I 9 times out of 10, when a parent feels like their child has been discriminated against and it's brought up, they win. Because nobody up here in British Columbia, Canada, nobody in education wants a lawsuit. And, parents can sue school districts. They can sue the ministry. Unfortunately, the ministry doesn't fund a lot of special needs categories the way they need to. But, you have every right to play the discrimination card and to play the human rights card. And I would, look in the United States what that looks like, because everyone is equal under the law and everybody should be treated fairly, right? So you just have to push, and hopefully you have a sympathetic ear. Unfortunately, if you run into a situation where from the top down, from the superintendent down, don't support special ed the way they need to, you might have to get a lawyer. You might have to push it, right? And unfortunately, you'd be in a system where they don't put a child first and they don't see the bigger picture in terms of the rest of the kids. And the best way for the rest of the kids to develop those beautiful character traits of empathy and compassion and kindness is to have a special needs kid in their classroom.
Right.
They learn to care for them. They learn to tolerate them. They learn to work with them. So that would be my suggestion is, you keep going up the chain and fighting the fight, and and play the human rights card if you have to. And the problem, is that teachers, administrators, and district people don't have the education around special ed either. And so they don't get it, or they don't have a child that has a special need.
Right.
And so that's where the struggle is that, when you run into great superintendents or teachers or principals who are great with special ed, typically they have a connection to a child with special needs, or they've done some education around it, right? So I don't know if that helps, but that's the path I would take.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Let's switch gears a little bit. What inspired you to write a book and explore the topic of mental health in schools?
For the same reasons that we're talking about around special ed.
Okay.
What I'm seeing in schools in the last 10 to 15 years that was exacerbated by COVID was there's this change in how our society kind of rolls, with the infusion of technology, with the difficulties for parents around being at home with their kids. It's all impacted on our kids' ability to cope. When we grew up, there was a lot of free play. We were always outside playing with our friends, and when you play, you naturally develop skills around communication, around being able to handle conflicts. You're more creative, and you can think critical, and you have to communicate, and you do so without parents around, right? Because you're with your buddies. And also, as kids, when we'd go home, our parents weren't on their phones. So our parents communicated with us, and, the gaming systems and the technology wasn't there. So we had to figure out how to play with our brothers and sisters. And now we're in this world, and it's not going to change. We're in this world where there's less free play. There's less attachment. There's less involvement from parents, because parents are sucked in by these things as well, and so I wanted to shed some light on what's going on in our schools in terms of the mental health of our kids, because what we're seeing in classrooms is, 15 years ago, there'd be 2 or 3 kids with some behavioral challenges in the classroom, and which typically revolved around their ability to handle stressful situations like the work is hard, or the
Right.
teacher has some demands on me, just those basic things that you need to do to get kids to
Yep.
learn. Now there's 6, 7, 8 kids, and they're dysregulated, and when they get stressed, they'll break down into tears, or they'll hit other kids, or they'll hit the teacher, or they'll storm out of the classroom or hide under desks. And when that happens, good luck trying to teach an English lesson or a math lesson.
Right.
And so I wrote the book to shed some light on what's going on in our school systems and our homes, honestly, and to have parents and teachers and educators understand the why, the science of emotions behind it, and to give them a path in terms of teaching kids how to learn how to cope again, how to self-regulate and self-soothe, and then that leads into building this collective capacity in schools, and whatnot. And I think, I wrote a second book around breathing. You can see it on my shelf behind me. It's called And Breathe. It's 50 fun breathing strategies for parents and teachers, because, at the heart of dealing with stress is the ability to soothe that polyvagal nerve that runs through your body, that's connected to your amygdala and your prefrontal cortex, right? If you
Mhm.
can soothe that, then you're going to be able to cope with stressful situations. So, I developed a book to help parents with teaching their kids how to breathe, which is what and teachers, and then that's where my third book kind of ties into that leadership piece around those 5 pillars and
Right.
building a school properly, so that way we can help our vulnerable kids cope better in school, and our teachers have a better chance at being as best as they can be, because teachers are bogged down. I just, at that workshop I did on Friday, had 2 teachers come to me. They've only been at it for 2 or 3 years. They're already thinking about leaving the profession,
Right.
because it's hard, right? So that's why I wrote that book, and then the other 2 have just kind of stemmed off of that. And my hope is that I can start changing some of these systems. The more workshops I can do, and the more podcasts, hopefully the right educators are listening, and we can hopefully make a difference, like you're doing.
Thank you. In one of your books, you discussed the concept of creating a pathway through the mental health crisis. Can you elaborate on what it is and how it can be implemented?
Yeah, so I'll use my school that I'm currently in as a perfect example. So
Sure.
a lot of what's happening with our children is their inability to cope, which means those characteristics and those skills around creative thinking, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, being personally and socially aware, aren't developing, which means they're not
Right.
even aware of their own emotions. They're not aware of how everyone else is feeling. And a lot of that stems from attachment and interaction, which comes from play.
Right.
And so one of the things that I've done at my school, for example, is I have 2 recesses and a lunch. So our kids get to school, they play in the morning when they get off the bus before classes start. They have a first recess where they're outside. They free play. Then they have a
Yep.
second recess where they free play. Then they have a lunch where they free play. And then on top of it, I use a program called Play is the Way, where I use structured play to teach social emotional well-being. So I'll use a structured play to elicit emotion from kids. I'll get them to get emotional, so I can teach them to self-soothe when they're in that moment.
Okay.
I know it sounds crazy, but what you're doing is you're poking the
Right.
bear, because you want them to learn while they're experiencing emotion. You don't get them
Right.
too high where they flip their lid, but you get them to that place. And so that way, when they're outside in that free place, or they're in class interacting with their teachers, when a moment comes up where they start feeling those emotions and they understand what emotion they're feeling, they can take some deep breaths and they can soothe, because they've practiced it.
Sure.
So that's the pathway, and you embed that into everything you do in the school. And so to do that, though, you need a common, and you can see these blue posters and these other
Yep.
posters behind me. So those are common, those are a common language philosophy. So when you go into a school, kids can identify with the yellow, the orange, the green, the purple, the red poster, and they can identify with those core competencies up there, which is communication and whatnot.
Sure.
And every teacher in the school, if they use that common language from kindergarten to
Right.
grade 12 or
Yep.
kindergarten to grade 7, and they understand the self-regulation piece around the science, like I talked about, that polyvagal nerve. And if they understand that science, they teach kids to understand their emotions and teach them when to use those emotions to calm with the common language. You'll transform your schools, and that's what I do a lot of my work in when I go and do these professional development workshops with teachers, because you can't, I'm sorry, when you go to professional development, you work on assessment and numeracy and literacy.
Right.
How do you get to that if your behavior's just off the rockers,
Right.
and your teachers are unhappy and your kids are unhappy? So it's you got to put the cart before the horse, and not dismiss the social emotional well-being piece, because you can't teach unless your class is regulated. So that's essentially it in a nutshell in terms of the structure, right? It's that attachment piece, and that letting kids interact, right? That's where they gain those skills.
So that makes a lot of sense to me for like elementary, the recesses. How does that translate to like upper grades where you don't have like necessarily like a recess time?
Well, what you have in high schools is you have a lot of athletics that happen. You have trades classes. One of the biggest areas, actually, because that I noticed that it impacted the most, the self-regulation piece, was in the senior sciences and senior math classes, because those kids typically are the ones who worry if they get a 91%, it's not 94%, and they can't get in, so they stress a lot more, and there's a lot more test anxiety. And so arming teachers with the skill set to teach self-regulation and breathing strategies with senior level kids, and using a common language in a high school, is just as important. And then your PE teachers, your shop teachers, when kids are monkey wrenching in the shop and they get pissed off because they slip and they bang their knuckles, it's like, okay, dude, and so that's where it's also embedded, is your shop teachers can learn those mindfulness pieces and whatnot, and it just expands out. So it's not so much that you have the recess, but you have the ability to have a dialogue with kids because they're more mature. And so you do it more so when there's a teachable moment that arises, right? And not to mention there's the structured piece. So then piece. So when I was in the high school, my high school teachers went through this play is the way program. At first they were like, oh, play is the way games. Like once they get to past the play part and they understand it's about mental health, it's easy to play a game of time ball in a math 12 class, or there's all kinds of things where you can get kids to play a quick brain break game because they love it. They love Heads Up, 7 Up, and things like that. And even at 17 years old, and then you tell them, it's like, hey, let's play this because we need to work on or get our emotions in check, and you take them through they'll just understand the science 10 times more, right? So it's more purposeful when you're in a high school than in an elementary. And in elementary school, they're still developing a lot of those basic skills that they're losing because of the lack of play and lack of attachment and parent connection and whatnot, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What is one tip you can share to help our listeners today to be more inclusive? So just one simple thing they can start today to be more inclusive.
You know what? To be mindful. Be mindful of everyone around you. And I think, as parents and, as kids who may not have a child that is vulnerable, the biggest thing is being socially aware. Recognize that when people around you are struggling, as long as it's not violent, when people are struggling, that they just might need you to listen and not look down on them, and to be, and to treat them like they may be struggling with something that you can't see. And that goes back to at the very beginning of our conversation when you talk about visible and invisible disabilities. And I would like people to err on the side of, maybe this person has an invisible disability that I should be a little more compassionate and empathetic about.
Yeah, I love that. Is there anything you want to talk about that we haven't discussed?
No, man. I think if this can get out there and some principals and teachers and school districts listens to this podcast, it might be a good opportunity for them to give me a call and I can come in and work with them. Unfortunately, a lot of leaders need to check their egos at the door and let somebody come in and help, right? So, sorry, my light just shut off here somehow. I don't know.
Okay.
All these technological issues, but that's the only thing I would think is be open to bringing somebody from the outside in to help and give you a different perspective, right? So,
are you ready for the last question?
You bet.
Do you like Spam? Yes or no?
Oh my God, I haven't seen a can of Spam. You know what? I love Spam when I was a kid, when it was fried. Cut it in pieces and you fry it. So we actually still eat a lot of bologna up here. So, but I have not seen a can of Spam on a store shelf in a long time.
Yeah, so I actually live in Austin, Minnesota, where the Hormel is located, and they make spam, and
Okay.
where the spam museum's located. So if you ever want to visit that, you got to come to Austin, Minnesota.
There's a spam museum. That
Yes,
is
sir.
that's awesome.
So yeah, I asked all my guests that, so it's kind of I just like the reaction. It's usually I don't know, it's usually pretty strong yes or pretty strong no is usually what
Yeah.
happens. Yeah, so
You can fry anything and add an egg to her, and she tastes pretty good. So I'm good.
yes. Where's the best place everybody can connect with you?
They can go to my website at leroyslanzi.com, or
Okay.
they can email me at leroyslanzi@gmail.com. That's you
Okay.
know what, that's probably the easiest thing. Send me an email, and I don't charge for people to email me and you know, poke at me and ask me some questions. I'm there to
Sure.
help, and yeah, it's that simple.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll make sure I put the email and the website and other stuff in the show notes. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Hey, you're welcome. Now I can go get ready for work.
There you go.
All right, man.
To all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Inclusive Dad Podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, rate, or review the show. Your feedback helps us connect with more champions of inclusion. Remember to share this podcast with friends and family who might benefit. If you want to support us in our mission, please click on the link in the show description. Together we can make the world more inclusive. Until next time, stay empowered and be a champion for inclusion.